Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Devorah Margolin, and I'm a senior research fellow here at the program on extremism. And I am delighted to welcome you all here today to our book talk with Drs. Steflja and Trisko Darden about their new book, Women as War Criminals. A little bit of background first. In the invite that you all got, you should have all gotten a 20% discount to the book. Check that out. There's a link and the code that you will need to purchase the book. And I'd like to begin by just doing a little bit of background on our speakers today, and then a little bit of the book, and then I will hand it over. So Dr. Izabela Steflja is a professor of practice in Department of Political Science, a member of the Violence Prevention Institute, and a fellow at the New Com Institute at Tulane University. Her research interests lie in the intersection of international criminal law and international development. She has conducted extensive field research in East and Central Africa and the Balkans, including interviews with numerous victims and perpetrators of conflicts in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. In addition to Women as War Criminals, her publications can be found in Third World Quarterly, Nationalities Papers, and Human Rights Review. In addition, we're joined by Dr. Jessica Trisko Darden, who is an assistant professor at the American University School of International Service and a non-resident fellow here at the program on extremism at George Washington University. In January, she'll be joining the Department of Political Science at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research examines the connection between political violence and international development efforts. She's the co-author of Insurgent Women, Female Combatants in Civil Wars with Georgetown University Press, and author of Aiding and Abetting, U.S. Foreign Assistance and State Violence with Stanford University Press. In their new book, Drs. Steflja and Trisko Darden analyze the legal cases of 4 women involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity. The authors argue that each of the women's complex identity influenced her treatment by legal systems and her ability to mount a gendered defense before the court. And with that, I will hand over the speaking time to Dr. Steflja.
Thank you, Devorah, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you and everyone attending. So I'm going to start by explaining how our book highlights that extremist groups depend on particular narratives that they use to get their followers to commit crimes. So these narratives are gendered, and they're gendered in a way that helps the group sustain itself as well as further its cause. So women, as we show in this book, can play a key role in constructing those narratives and also playing out the roles that are assigned to them. So I'm going to start by giving you an example of somebody who helped construct an extremist narrative. One of our case studies is former president of Republika Srpska in Bosnia, Biljana Plavšić. And Biljana Plavšić helped construct the genocidal narrative by arguing that there is a biological problem, a biological deficiency when it comes to Bosnian Muslims. And she suggested that, in fact, they became traitors during the Ottoman Empire when they converted to Islam, and that this is somehow passed on through their genes. So she made a number of speeches suggesting this. And just to give you a bit of background on Biljana Plavšić, she has a PhD in botany. She was heading the Department of Biology at the University of Sarajevo. She was widely published and had a Fulbright, and was a very well-known academic and scientist before becoming a politician. So her views were listened to. So also, in addition to women who help construct these narratives, there's a larger, more general narrative that is gendered. And in former Yugoslavia, that narrative was based around on the idea that women are mothers and nurturers of national heroes and martyrs. So this is more of an nurturing and educational narrative surrounding women. We have seen this narrative is quite common in other conflicts as well. For example, ISIS tasks women with indoctrinating the next generation, so sort of nurturing and teaching their children to pass on the ideology and the narrative as well. And this role of sort of guarding the narrative and guarding the ideology that women are assigned plays an important role in recruiting as well, because then they become important recruiters for the group. So another example that we look at in the book is the example of Hoda Mothana. She is a former student at the University of Alabama who decided to join ISIS, and she was a key voice and a key recruiter for ISIS in many ways, using social media posts. So she definitely embraced this role of being the guardian and the educator on the ideology. So in these gendered narratives, women are often pitted against each other. Women of different backgrounds and women in different groups are often pitted against each other. And that too supports the extremist goals. I'm going to give you an example from Rwanda again, where Tutsi women were hypersexualized during the conflict, and they were presented as dangerous for Hutu women because they were their competition, but also for the Hutu nation because they were seen as women who, with their sexuality, could threaten Hutu men and Hutu power. So then Hutu women were called upon to murder Tutsi women and to make sure that their men are on the right track, sort of to ensure that they're on the right path to Hutu power. And many women responded to that, to that narrative. So what we highlight in this book, and what I want to emphasize, is that these gendered narratives, we cannot see women in them just as victims. We have to see these narratives as political tools that men and women can benefit from. So women are also political and ideological actors, and they use these narratives for their goals as well. Pauline Miramashihuko, a case from Rwanda that we look at, she was the Minister of Family and Women's Development in Rwanda. She ordered Hutu men to rape Tutsi women before killing them. In fact, she saw it as this sexual reward that they could have in order to be inspired to continue the massacres. So she definitely participated and helped construct this narrative that over-sexualized Tutsi women during the conflict. So that was just one little highlight of some of the actions that women have committed and some of the violent crimes that women have committed. And I'm going to let Jessica continue on this topic and tell you how exactly are women violent and what are the crimes, the exact crimes that they commit.
Just to interrupt really quickly before, I'd like to remind our audience that we have a question and answer function on the side, and you can begin submitting questions now as well. Thank you. Jessica.
Great, thanks so much. And just to add to what Izabela noted, these kind of gendered narratives continue today. So earlier this week, there was a lot of controversy in India about a jewelry store ad that came out that was tied by kind of right-leaning Hindu extremists to Muslim love jihad. And the ad depicted a young Hindu woman and her Muslim mother-in-law. And it was tied to kind of extremist narratives in India about how Hindus are being stolen by Muslim families, how women are being recruited as part of a love jihad. And so we continue to see these extremely gendered narratives being used by extremist groups. And this is a pattern that's going to continue and has existed for a very long time. But that is, as Izabela noted, we draw a lot of attention to. We also, in Women as War Criminals, provide evidence of the kind of range and breadth of women's participation in extremist violence. And while we focus on a few key cases that Izabela introduced, we also have kind of other characters that appear in the book. And so some of the characters that appear in our book have committed crimes, including the murder of prisoners of war. So very extreme and very clear violations of the accepted laws of war. But this range is really extensive. And so it goes from extrajudicial killings, murder, acts of genocide, acts of ethnic cleansing, to simply standing by while men commit atrocities on behalf of the group. Yet in every case, we forefront women's agency. Right? Women are not passive spectators in war crimes and crimes against humanity. They are very active participants, and their roles can range from actual perpetration of violence to propagation of extremist narratives, right? To kind of tacit support. So in a couple of examples, we start off the book with a woman named Steflja who participated in the conflict in former Yugoslavia. And she was 19 at the time. She was very low ranking in a Bosnian self-defense unit known as Zulfikar. And Steflja was eventually indicted as the first Bosnian Muslim woman indicted for war crimes in a Bosnian court because she participated in a firing squad that executed 6 civilians. And in all, 22 civilians were killed on that particular day, including women and the elderly. And so it shows that kind of these conflicts pit women on different sides of extremist narratives, as Izabela noted, but that also women vary in their own participation in this violence. And so one really key factor that we identify is that, you know, women take on important roles in armed conflict, but depending on the group's ideology, the extremist ideology, that can constrain or expand their opportunities for participation. So in some instances, like ISIS and many other Islamist groups, the nature of that ideology really prevents women's frontline participation in conflict. Instead, we see them in much more prominent roles as fundraisers, recruiters, propagandists. Nevertheless, by calling for acts of violence against civilians and encouraging the perpetration of ethnic cleansing and other war crimes, we argue that these women should and must be considered as war criminals under the international and domestic legal jurisdictions. At the same time, right, we do understand that there's a difference between perpetrating acts of ethnic cleansing and kind of condoning or calling for those acts. And so the difficulty with women's involvement, because it is so varied, is that there has to be a lot of nuance to our understanding and also to the legal remedies that we apply. And so some of that nuance is from the fact that women who actually perpetrate acts of violence and war crimes on the front lines have a tendency to be younger in age, do take part in kind of uniformed forces, whether those are linked directly to the state or kind of militias or paramilitary groups. But in other cases, such as Rwanda, women who perpetrated genocide were regular women and neighbors. And so we have a diversity of actors here, some of whom are extremely high-ranking politically, who have membership in a social elite, and then also women who are very much from a commonplace background. And so we take all of this into account in the book and really focus on how some groups were placing women in particularly prominent roles. So for instance, during the Rwandan genocide, as Izabela mentioned, we had Pauline Miramashihuko, who had a formal role in the genocidal government, but other key women played roles in Rwanda as well, including Pauline's daughter-in-law, who was convicted of immigration fraud here in the United States for lying about her participation in the genocide, but as well Valérie Bemeriki of Radio Télévision Libre de Margolin, who Izabela actually had the opportunity to interview while in prison. And Valérie played a really key role as a top journalist in propagating the narrative of the genocidal government, but at the same time, she was held responsible by the Rwandan government and is currently in prison in Kigali. So we really examine how kind of this range of violence and range of engagement leads to a diversity of outcomes that we think deserve better explanation and greater attention. Thank you.
And if I may just add there to Jessica's summary or really important points on women's actions, I think it's also important to emphasize and look at how these women act after the violence takes place and after they're imprisoned, or so whether while serving their sentence or when they're out of prison. And so something that was in some way surprising was that we didn't find women show more remorse as the media and a lot of legal specialists actually expected them to do so. So while we were researching, so there's a lot of expectations of female defendants to plead guilty, to apologize, to show remorse, to also be more willing to reconcile or to lead reconciliation with their enemies. And we didn't find that with our cases. We found that female defendants used these gendered expectations when they were on trial. So whether to get better sentences or better treatment in prison, they were also encouraged to plead guilty by their defense teams. Two of the cases that we look at, Biljana Plavšić and Lindy England, which is our soldier case, the US Abu Ghraib scandal case. And she was encouraged to plead guilty. So a lot of them are encouraged to show remorse and plead guilty. However, sort of looking at the memoirs they publish while in prison or the interviews that they give once they're out, we didn't find evidence of remorse or apology. So for example, even though Plavšić pleaded guilty to ethnic cleansing, that was one out of 9 charges that she was indicted on. In her memoirs that she wrote in prison, she wrote 2 memoirs, in fact, they're called Svedočim, which means I testify. So she testified in her memoirs that in fact she is rejecting her guilt and that she's rejecting the reconciliation promoted by the Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia. She continued to make racist and sexist depictions of Bosnian Muslims in these books. And in fact, she states very clearly that the only thing that she's sorry for is victims who are Serb. And similarly, in the case of the student, Hoda Mothana, we are yet to see sort of a degree of understanding on her part about the harms that ISIS causes to their victims, or that how she participated in that herself. So what we find is that female defendants who cater to these expectations about women being more remorseful, so female defendants who are willing to be more compliant and more obedient during their trials, they in fact do often escape the full weight of justice. But what we argue is that this should not be interpreted as genuine remorse on the part of these women. We don't see evidence of women being more remorseful than men.
Excellent. Thank you both so much for sharing those thoughts. I already see some questions rolling in, but of course, I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative and begin the question and answer session. First of all, thank you so much for sharing this book with me. I really enjoyed reading it. As I read it, it did make me think of my own research and the research I do on women and violent extremism, and it made me think of a quote from 1983 from Hartstock, which says that perceived female weakness in patriarchal society comes from women's designation in a secondary role in society, and all women share a distinctive experience of life based on their actual or potential role in childbearing. And I think that really comes into play in this book, where we have 4 different case studies at 4 very different levels. We have a president, we have a minister, the soldier, and the student. And we see different power dynamics, and we see different levels of agency in geographical locations. And I guess I just wanted to ask, how did you pick your case studies? Where did this come from? And how did you feel that each of the case studies kind of embodied an aspect of what you were trying to convey in this research? And I believe Jessica will be taking this one.
That's such an interesting quote and an interesting comment, because motherhood is so front and center in our cases in ways that we never expected, right? That we didn't anticipate when selecting these cases and beginning our analysis. But for instance, in our Rwandan case of Pauline Miramashihuko, her son was actually involved in the perpetration of crimes of genocide, and she was seen as commanding him to do so. So the mother-son relationship was very prominent in reporting, but also in their legal case, where they were both held responsible as part of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. In the case of Biljana Placic, she in fact did not have a child, and this was something that critics routinely identified, that somehow she was kind of lesser as a woman for not having had a child. But we see during the course of that conflict that she adopts narrative of motherhood and positions herself not as the mother of any particular individual, but as a mother of the Serb people. And so increasingly, we've seen kind of that concept front and center, particularly in the trial of the court-martial of Lindy England, who was pregnant and delivered during that process, as well as Hoda Mothana, who has a young child. That being said, you know, we chose a diversity of cases, in part because we want to illustrate kind of the evolution of legal approaches towards female war criminals. So the 2 international tribunal cases focus on kind of the UN's process for dealing with war crimes, but also occurred in this moment where international law seemed to have a consensus about how to deal with war crimes, how to deal with conflict more generally. And it was this moment of great hope and unity that the international community could deal with these things. The other 2 cases of Lindy England and Hoda Mothana are very much in the post 9/11 counterterrorism context, which eroded that international legal consensus. And so those cases allow us to explore the US military justice system and the practice of court-martials, as well as get into kind of contemporary contention around how to deal with terrorism legally and practically. But Izabela can also speak more to some of the kind of rationale underlying our cases.
Thank you, Devorah and Jessica, for that great question. One thing that on the topic of motherhood in narratives, one thing that I want to point out is, and something that I find interesting and frustrating, is that while we see motherhood play this central role for women who don't even have children, this is so different from fatherhood missing out of many other cases, because many male defendants are fathers. And we contrast that in some of the cases in our book, and in the case of Rwanda in particular, we had high profile father and son genocidaires, but they never made it into the media, and especially not in the international media, and did not gain so much attention like the case of the mother and son genocidaires. So I think it's important to point out that double standard that is still so prevalent in how we understand who can and who cannot perpetrate violence. So, and then in terms of case selection, I think it was important for us to look at women at different levels in the hierarchy, in the power hierarchy. So I had the research actually started with Biljana Plavšić, because I had conducted a lot of research in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda on the tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And I sort of found a discrepancy where in Rwanda, we had publications at the international level coming out suggesting that women were very violent, whereas in Bosnia, we didn't have that highlighted. And I was not happy about this inconsistency, because during my research, I had interviewed a lot of women who were extremists in their views. And, I thought that had they all had the opportunity to commit violence, that many of them would likely have done so. So when the case of Biljana Plavšić was taken up at the International Criminal Tribunal and the opportunity to look at that, I sort of jumped with excitement and decided that this was a wonderful way to challenge the dominant narrative. But the cases of Pauline Miramashihuko and Biljana Plavšić, they are both women in power, women who have political power. So we thought it was important to balance this with the cases of the student and the soldier that Jessica has a lot more expertise on than I do.
Excellent, thank you so much. And building on the choices of case studies, for those of us who've had a chance to read your book already, you touch on this, and I'd love if you could expand on the idea of beyond gender. We have different, socioeconomic levels, races, religions at play in your case studies. And I wanted to know, kind of beyond gender, what role do you think race, religion, and international politics played? You kind of touched a little bit on the case studies of Hoda Mothana versus Sam El-Hassani here in the US, a young Arab woman versus a young white convert, and how does that come into play? And I believe, Izabela, this is for you.
Sure, I'll start with that one. Two of our cases deal with race and ethnicity and religion in important ways. So Pauline Miramashihuko, who is a Black Rwandan woman who faced trial at the international level, and then Hoda Mothana, as you mentioned, who was born in the US but is of Yemeni background. So what we find is that when it comes to racialized female perpetrators, legal professionals seem unprepared to deal with these cases. They definitely become less humanized during the trials, is what we argue, because sort of there's this stereotype and standard of thinking of African Black women in particular as poor, as victimized, as violated by men, as women who are in need of protection, protection from men, protection from even Western feminists, depending on who you talk to, right? So then when you're faced with a Black African woman and American woman of Arab background, of Arab Muslim background, right? Sort of these women were used to seeing as victims rather than as perpetrators. So when they become perpetrators, sort of the legal community is not used to dealing with these kinds of cases. It's much more difficult to understand them as complex characters. And I think we see evidence of that in the case of Pauline, who is just treated by the tribunal as one of the guys. Sort of her gender is just not even mentioned during the trial. In fact, the tribunal goes out of their way to not deal with gender. And in some ways, that's good because, well, we could say, okay, it's not sort of falling for a gender defense. But in another way, we're missing, we're not learning anything about the gendered context of the Rwandan genocide if we just treat Pauline as one of the guys rather than as a complex political character who had her own intentions and her own reasons for committing the crimes that she did.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that in the case of Lindy England, which received a lot of publicity here in the United States in 2006 when the photos of the Abu Ghraib abuse came out, one really interesting thing in revisiting that case so many years later is that, you know, with kind of a new perspective, we see narratives about disability playing a very important role in her court-martial. And in particular, this idea that from a very young age, she had a learning processing disorder. She struggled in school. She struggled particularly with social relationships in school and was under the care of a psychologist, you know, her entire school career. And her defense really pointed to this learning disability as evidence of her inability to make proper judgments. Right. So in emphasizing this disability, it was really an attempt to kind of strip her of agency. And interestingly, you know, the Army comes out looking a bit more progressive on this issue and saying that, well, she enlisted, she passed basic training, she performed all of her functions in the US Army as a reservist and as someone who was called up for active duty, perfectly fine. Right? So there's again this complexity about whether, you know, she has agency or doesn't, the degree to which her disability may impede her judgment or not. And it's never fully resolved. It's never fully resolved in discussions of her case and the legal judgments or even now in the kind of subsequent interviews that have been done with Lindy England.
That's a very fascinating point. And it kind of brings up a question brought by one of our audience members, Justin Polsky, apologies, who says, once ISIS/ISIL changed the narrative from bride recruitment to encourage active combatants, the social identity and social movement theories changed before recruitment changed, therefore recruitment changed. While most movements happen within borders, ISIS and ISIL were able to recruit outside of borders. How should prosecutorial procedures be defined or delineated if a female was recruited as a bride as opposed to an active combatant? Jessica, I believe that's for you.
Yeah, thanks. I think we'll both handle this. This is a fascinating question, right? Because it depends on whether we think women's motivations matter, right? And so the idea, you know, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is that, oh, well, if I just want to marry a fighter, it's different than saying I want to go and join and support that group. But the underlying question for me is like, well, what are you achieving by just marrying a fighter, right? Are you not intending to support that individual and their mission and indirectly support their mission, right? And so it gets us into all of these kind of tricky areas about, you know, the woman who stands behind the man and how much they're responsible for that man's success and how much should be attributed to them, but, you know, in a very different context, right? I think that, you know, governments cross-nationally have moved to criminalize membership in a foreign terrorist organization. That has been a kind of consistent decision. And yet this exact question, right, comes up in the kind of legal treatment of women who are married to, for instance, members of the Taliban, right? Are those women, should they by default be considered as members of the Taliban, even though that group does not allow women's participation in combat or any other functions, right? So ultimately, it comes back to this idea of what is the ideology of the group, what is the structure of the group, and what space do they create for women's participation? And if we look back to World War II, right, 1/3 of German women were members of the Nazi Party. Women had clear roles under Nazi ideology to propagate the German race, to raise racially pure children. But they also played important roles in the Nazi killing machine as secretaries, as concentration camp guards. And so to say that the women who were members of the party and were wives at home played a different role from concentration camp guards, yes, that is functionally true. But to say that they didn't contribute to the death and destruction wrought by Nazi Germany and the Holocaust and the occupation of Eastern Europe is false, in my mind. And so I agree that there's a tension here, but legal systems, I think, have developed ways of dealing with this tension.
Okay, what I'd like to add here is this question sort of makes me think about why men join, right? And whether we consider their reasons for joining. So maybe they may not join for marriage, but there are a lot of men in the Democratic Republic of Congo who will join a rebel group because for basic socioeconomic security, to feed themselves and their families, right? Is that somehow worse than or better than somebody who decides to join for marriage? I don't know but I think it's important to think about that sort of men don't just join these violent movements because they're inherently violent and because they all believe 100% in the ideologies of the movements, right? I think it's really important to acknowledge that men also have different reasons for joining. And another comment and a sort of remark that something that we need to consider is, of course, whether this is forced marriage or not, right? Sort of whether this is somebody joined because they were kidnapped. So, and legal systems are trying to figure that out right now. We have the case of Dominic Ongwen, who was former child soldier in the LRA in Uganda, and sort of his case we haven't seen the conclusion on it yet because of COVID, unfortunately, but at the international level, definitely the ICC is trying to look at complicated cases where, sort of we can't really decide whether this is somebody voluntarily joining a group or not.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting points that you both brought up. I would just kind of add my own 2 cents, which is the idea of rebel governance in areas where a group physically takes control of a territory. There could be less agency of those that live under, both men and women. If a group comes in, occupies your village, and says, go show up to work or we'll kill your whole family, that's very different than somebody who chooses to leave their country, either in Europe or here in North America, and travel to join a group knowing the brutality of that organization. And I think that's kind of one thing I would touch on as well. Excellent. We have a question from Dr. Lauren Shapiro, who asks, while I do not contest women's agency in crimes, exploitation of women in paternalistic society is the norm. How does the situation in which women find themselves impact their behavior? For example, there's limited resources during war, so participating as requested by government improves a woman's personal situation in terms of money and food. However, their behaviors are usually outside the norm during peacetime.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So no one made Lindy England sign up for the Army Reserves. Her family was opposed. She did it while she was still in high school because she saw, as you noted, the Army as a potential avenue for upward mobility, right? As a way to finance college when her parents were working night shifts and she grew up in a trailer park. But no one made her do it, right? No one made Hoda Mothana drop out of college and buy a plane ticket to Turkey and ask to be smuggled across the border into Syria, right? We can argue that she was brainwashed, she was persuaded, but actually as someone who grew up in a very patriarchal home, she defied that structure. She broke out of that structure and did what she as an individual wanted to do, right? So we do accept that the different cases and women that we examine are situated within unique cultures that have their own hierarchies and their own systems of order. But all of the women that we examine actually defied those social orders in very important ways. And in the cases of Biljana Plavšić and Pauline Miramashihuko, actually worked their way up through those social orders, but ultimately got some pushback. And so I think that the actions that we examine are acceptable neither in wartime nor in peacetime. And that's what makes our focus a little bit different. But Izabela, I'm sure you have something to add on this.
Right. I do think it's important to highlight that a lot of the cases we look at are women who see violence as a way of moving up in society and escaping that patriarchal structure, right? So so gaining agency in that sense. And this makes me think of my interview with Valerie Bemeriki, and you know, she didn't say anything about being a woman, leading, being a top journalist in a radio station. She talked about her commitment and her belief to the fact that she believed that the Hutus would be oppressed if Tutsis came to power. She believed in that narrative and emphasized that to me, that this is something that she was taught in school and something that she wholeheartedly believed and thought she was defending her people, and that this was her job, and in her position she could actually make a difference for her people, right? So sort of in cases like that, definitely women's connections to their groups, whether it's ideology, ethnicity, nation, whatever it is, can overpower their sort of support for other women and then gender causes.
Where we do see patriarchy really coming out, though, is in women's kind of statements once conflict ends and once they're facing a judicial system, right? So, for instance, in the case of Steflja, you know, she testified in Bosnian court, well, I was only 19, there was a male commander, I was just doing what I was told, I was just a girl doing what I was told. And we see this also in, you know, kind of Lindy England and the Abu Ghraib scandal more generally. Well, there were male higher-ups who were telling us what to do, right? Hoda Mothana has now very much adopted a kind of what we would term the jihadi brides narrative, where, oh, I was brainwashed, I was persuaded, you know, the recruiters made me do it. And so there is this very generalized sense of patriarchal victimization, but we only see that come out when these women are kind of being held to account for their crimes.
Well, that was my next question. So that's an excellent answer that you just answered that for us. So I guess I'd like to then ask the policy question. So what can we learn from these gendered assumptions that emerge in the trials of female war criminals that's applicable to research and policy today? And what policy related impact do you hope this book will have? Izabela, I believe, for you.
Sure. So I think one key thing that we'd like to accomplish is to have these defendants be seen as more complex characters, not merely as women, but as women who have political interests, political agency, have intersections in their identity, and sort of their commitments to those different identities be recognized at the legal level. Sort of the way too often we still continue to fall into the trope of man made me do it, and that is acceptable still. Sort of this is the most common defense, and it's the defense for our extremely powerful defendants like Biljana Plavšić, who blamed the other co-president, and Slobodan Milošević and Ratko Mladić, so the army chief and the other co-president, for sort of what she's done, and minimized her own role in organizing the mass killings. And we see the same thing in Pauline's defense, where she says, oh, but I'm a mother, I wouldn't even kill a chicken, right? So sort of this still works a lot of the time, and it's still emphasized by the media as well. And so we'd like to sort of have a consensus on the fact that legal actors, legal specialists are influenced by our societal views, and we'd like cases looked at more in a case-by-case manner, where the complexities of each perpetrators are taken into account.
Yeah, and I would say if we dig in on one case in particular that I know other folks at the program on extremism have also looked at, the case of Samantha El-Hassani, who's currently in federal custody in Indiana and awaiting sentencing. It kind of shows how this man made me do it narrative still plays out. So she was initially indicted on kind of a broad range of charges related to aiding and abetting terrorism for her role in helping move money in support of ISIS and providing material support to her husband and brother-in-law, who fought, and her husband was ultimately killed while fighting on behalf of ISIS. She pled guilty in advance of her trial to a single count of financing terrorism with a maximum sentence of 10 years. And what I find so particularly frustrating about this case is that countries like the United States do have universal jurisdiction for war crimes. This woman and her husband purchased and enslaved 3 Yazidi children whom her husband sexually abused. Why are we not prosecuting her for slavery, right? Why are we not prosecuting her for a host of crimes that she has been implicated in? And essentially, the answer comes down to, oh, well, evidence. And I think that's what's been really frustrating about kind of prosecution for contemporary war crimes more generally, but especially in the context of the Syrian civil war. We've seen such little concerted international action to document evidence of these war crimes and follow up with rigorous prosecutions. Instead, countries have relied on terrorism statutes that, while yes, they provide an avenue for prosecution, many times we're not prosecuting people for the most relevant crimes, and we're not giving voice or justice to their victims by relying on these broad counterterrorism statutes. So what I would like to see from a policy perspective is greater use of universal jurisdiction for war crimes and crimes against humanity, which most countries that had kind of ISIS fighters emanate from have. Australia, Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, all have universal jurisdiction statutes. And Germany has really been at the forefront of applying these statutes. So one woman is currently being prosecuted in Germany for war crimes related to the death of a 5-year-old Yazidi girl that she had enslaved. And I think that that is taking those crimes seriously and taking women's roles in those crimes seriously. So it goes back to this question, okay, so even if women in all instances were not fighting on the front lines, were not directly involved in the murder or rape of individuals, they were still committing heinous acts and still calling for the perpetration of heinous acts. And we fail to take those women seriously. While at the same time, we see countries prosecuting children as young as 9 years old for terrorism-related offenses, when under international law, any individual under the age of 18 should be immune from prosecution and should be placed in a kind of restorative justice process. So we've seen kind of this mass erosion of international law norms regarding war crimes, regarding the participation of children. And I think, you know, human rights groups are standing up in defense of those norms, but there's really attention, particularly in the United States and Western European countries, about how to deal with this issue. And so we have a piece coming out in the Texas National Security Review that takes up some of these legal issues. I know other folks have been as well, but I would like to see much more concerted effort on how to deal with kind of the legal aspects of modern day war crimes.
Yeah, I think you touch on a very interesting point, that a lot of these women specifically that chose to go and join the Islamic State had agency while going. And then when things stopped going their way, that agency disappeared. You see that with Samantha al-Hassani, and you also see that with Hoda Mothana, who talked about, you know, she was a huge advocate when she got there, and only about 2 years in, when things started to turn and her life didn't turn out as utopian as she thought it would, did that rhetoric really change and that denial of agency begin? And I think that's an interesting point. Touching on that also, I mean, we're talking about gender, so gender is also men and women, but we're talking about the Beatles will be coming, are in the US now, and we'll be seeing the case here and the war crimes that they'll be charged with. And it'll be interesting to see if that will be kind of an example that the US can use. It's a little bit of a slam dunk case compared to many of these other cases, but it will be interesting to see how that trial plays out here. And if it becomes that the US is the platform for how to carry out these trials if necessary. Excellent. So we're running low on time, but I guess my final question for you is, what was it like to research this book, and something that it kind of surprised you in the exploration of this topic? And this question's actually addressed to both of you. So Izabela, I'll start with you, and then we'll end with Jessica. But kind of, did something surprise you as you researched this book?
Forgot to unmute myself there for a second. So I think sort of what we've been talking about recently, sort of the lack of initiative to repatriate these people so that they can be tried, is something that surprised me, because I don't come from a terrorism background. I'm more of a civil war scholar, and I was focusing mainly on the tribunals and international criminal law. But sort of working with Jessica on this book and learning about cases like Hoda Mothana, one thing that surprised me, and one thing that I kept pushing Jessica on in that particular chapter is, well, why is the US not taking the opportunity to bring this woman back and make this into trial, almost that show trial, or to make an example out of this woman, right? So we're spending all this money in sort of anti-terrorism efforts, and to make sure that young women and young men are not recruited. But then here's one example of something gone terribly wrong. And I thought she would be a great example for sort of the media as well. But there has been so much effort in making sure that she stays out of the US, rather than that her legal case be taken on. So that's something that still I find extremely fascinating. And I think it has to do a lot with sort of the country's commitment to their national security, rather than to these laws that they sign on to statutes, and they make these grand statements about believing in the rule of law and what it can accomplish. But then when it comes down to the actions, it seems like a lot of them are not willing to sort of put their money in that area.
What really stood out to me was, frankly, how many women war criminals still live among us. So we are still finding, you know, Nazi war criminals in Germany and Austria, but here in the United States, You know, women working at chicken processing plants in Kentucky have international warrants out for their arrest for war crimes. You know, your nice neighbor in small town Massachusetts, turns out she was a Rwandan genocidaire. And there are just so many of these cases. And, you know, I really applaud the people at the Department of Justice who are working on these issues, because these are difficult cases, and most of the time, because the way US statutes are written, the United States really can only go after them on immigration-related charges. But a report came out in Canada about 2 weeks ago that really focused on how Canada has been underutilizing its universal jurisdiction in prosecuting war criminals in Canada. And so this isn't just it's not just that the United States is a safe harbor for all of these war criminals. It's true of most open Western democratic nations that had liberal immigration systems, and where individuals genuinely thought they were bringing in kind of refugees and individuals fleeing from war. It just so happens that oftentimes these individuals were fleeing because they had committed gross war crimes and were seeking to evade justice. So there's always going to be some really small percentage of individuals who have those ties. And I think what's been really shocking to me is how many cases are ongoing, how many individuals have been kind of extradited from the United States to face war crimes trials, and in some instances been allowed to return because they've maintained US citizenship. And so that process of kind of stripping citizenship, which we talk about a little bit towards the end of the book, is not automatically applied to individuals charged with war crimes. So in some instances, we've had, you know, folks from the former Yugoslavia who've been able to return to the United States because they retained citizenship, even after serving prison terms for war crimes. And so the kind of war criminals that live among us has been a really fascinating aspect of this book for me.
Thank you both so much, Dr. Trisko Darden and Dr. Steflja, for being here today. For those of you who haven't yet gotten your copy, please do look at the invite. There is a link and a 20% off code. I highly recommend it. And thank you all for joining the program on extremism today to talk about women as war criminals. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.